Another process in the psychological flexibility model is self as context. Self as context also can be thought of as perspective taking. And this really refers to situations where clients get stuck on stories that are not helpful, or get trapped in certain identities that are limiting. So Charles has this story that he can only connect with people of a similar cultural background. And I don't need to challenge that story. It's based on some history that I'm sure that's true to some degree. So again, this question that comes up with diffusion also comes up here is, how is this serving you? How is that story serving you? And part of the idea of self as context is that any concept we have about ourselves is essentially limiting or reductionistic, right? So any idea that I have of myself is really just a small part of me. And when we over-identify with parts of ourselves, sometimes that leads to being stuck in life. So Charles, you could say, was stuck inside that story of I can only connect with people of similar cultural backgrounds. And what I might ask Charles initially around this story is, what's it like to live in that story? What experience has that story led you to? And to see if we can create some flexibility and ask him to think about himself in other ways. Tell me about other ways you think about yourself. And he might generate several examples. Well, I think of myself as a really good listener, or I think of myself as a helping person. You know, Charles chose to be in a helping profession. And sometimes I would give a homework assignment of a worksheet that just has the words I am and then a blank, and that's repeated over and over again. And the client's task is just to fill in as many answers to that question as possible. And usually that can generate a wide range of identities or stories that we hold about ourselves. And then I would ask Charles, which of these is most useful to you in working with your social anxiety or in social situations? Or which of these would you like to prioritize as a story that you want to hold about yourself? And so I'm emphasizing this idea of choice, that we get to be our author of our identity in the same way that we get to choose our own values. That Charles is really the person who is best equipped on this planet to decide how he wants to think of himself and how he wants to hold himself. And I mentioned that Charles is very self-critical. And so this is another area where this process and act can be really helpful. So again, we've talked about changing the relationship to anxiety or to shame. And here the idea would not be to get rid of self-criticism, but to help Charles change the way he relates to himself. And so self-criticism might still be there. That part of him that beats himself up, that part of him that puts himself down, might still do its thing, especially in social contexts. And Charles has some agency in how he responds to that. And so one idea that is a good antidote to self-criticism is the concept of self-compassion. And indeed, Charles is a very compassionate person to other people. And so helping him extend that same set of values towards himself might be part of the work that could be really useful. And so that can be challenging, especially because for a lot of folks who are self-critical, that's an ingrained habit. That's an ingrained pattern of behavior. And so this is something that takes some time to change. And that would be part of my initial work around this with Charles, would be to introduce this idea of self-compassion and to help him notice all of the different ways that he beats himself up. And so that's really a big piece of understanding self-criticism, is the awareness, because most people who are self-critical don't even realize the degree to which they are hard on themselves in ways that they would not be to other people. And so one common perspective taking method to deal with self-criticism would be to ask Charles, how would you talk to a friend with the same problem? Or what would you say to a loved one who is having the same difficulty? Or what would you say to me if I said, I'm really struggling with going out and being with other people? And often that's fairly easy for clients to do. And I would expect that Charles could pretty easily come up with a compassionate response if it were me who were struggling with his problems. And so to help him make that connection, that same advice or wisdom or compassion that he would extend to me also applies to him. And so that might be a homework assignment that I would give Charles every day. Perhaps I would ask him to sit down and think about something he struggled with, and then ask him to write down what advice he would give to someone else who had that same problem. And so that's one way to practice self-compassion, is to use that kind of perspective-taking method. And other ways might involve focusing on doing self-compassionate behaviors. So one of the things that people get often confused by is they think self-compassion is a feeling, like a warm and fuzzy, loving feeling that one has towards oneself. And sure, self-compassion can include that, but that's not necessarily all of what we're talking about, especially in someone like Charles, who often feels really bad about himself. And so it's not a feeling, it's a behavior, it's a relationship. So if you were to be kinder to yourself, Charles, what would that look like? You know, and clients might generate things like, well, I might take better care of my body. I might eat well. I might treat myself to a day off more often. And so I would help him identify some specific things in his routine, some action items that he could then practice for homework as almost like symbols of self-compassion. And I would ask him to do these things with that quality in mind. In other words, if he says, you know, I'm going to spend half an hour a day reading science fiction because that's something that he loves and that he's gotten away from. And so the homework wouldn't be just to read science fiction, but it would read it with the spirit of, this is an offering to himself. This is a way that he is practicing taking care of himself by engaging with this meaningful pursuit. And a metaphor that I often use for describing self-compassion is in the building of a house. So clients come to us like Charles with a self-critical house. In other words, over the years, this well-established structure of self-criticism and beating up on oneself is pretty well established. And so we're not trying to tear that house down and build a house where it used to be so that there's no remnants of self-criticism. Rather, we're trying to build another house next door. And initially, that second house might just have a foundation. It might just have a skeletal structure of a building. But over time, as that house becomes more developed, perhaps that will be a place that you'll choose to spend more of your time living. You still might find yourself going back to the old house, but you can always choose then to leave that old house and come back into the new house. So again, we come back to this idea of not getting rid of anything, but we're adding in something. We're adding in self-compassion and helping Charles be kinder to himself, especially after social situations. So what I might also ask Charles to do is, whenever he does have a planned social situation, to spend some time afterwards in some activity of self-compassion, whether that's reading science fiction or doing something that's enjoyable to himself as a way to practice giving himself credit for doing something that was hard.